Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar. It is 9 o'clock and we do have quite a lot of content to cover, so I think we will jump right in. My name is Constance Duke, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of Sustainability and the Technical Practice Lead at Sustain.Life. I've actively worked in sustainability, mostly corporate sustainability, for about 16 years. And now, together with my talented team, I help shape the tools and features in our platform. I am joined today by my esteemed colleague and Sustain.Life's Head of Product, Jasmine Zhuang, and our special guest, Dr. Lyubomir Macek-Ukrainsky, who's an accomplished academic and the head of sustainability consulting practices at Alex, which is a leading international consultancy. Jasmine and Luco, would you like to say a few words about yourselves?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Jasmine Zhuang. I'm our head of product here at Sustain.Life. So that means I work very closely with Constance's team, the sustainability team, as well as our design and engineering teams to build out all of the features and functionality that you see in our application, as well as plan for our future roadmap. So thanks so much for coming today.
Hi, everyone. Hi, everyone. My name is Lubko. I'm based in Germany. I'm covering two hats. I work at the university, and here I'm responsible for two topics: sustainability and social entrepreneurship. I basically help students and academic staff to create their own startup, hopefully sustainable and nature inspired. That's the first part. And the second part, I'm leading the consultancy, sustainability consultancy practice at Alex. And there we look at how the digital technology can help to achieve the net zero goals. Our focus is certain industries and Europe, but we are looking forward to the collaboration with Sustain.Life. This is a nice collaboration. Thank you very much, Constance.
Wonderful introductions. Thank you both. I'll just cover a few quick notes on housekeeping. Please feel free to post questions in the Q&A feature, and if we have time at the end, we will try our best to answer them, though we do have a lot of content today. We'll also respond to some questions throughout the event, and then if we can't get to your question today, we are more than happy to send you a response after the event, but we can only do that if you don't post your question anonymously, because otherwise we don't have your email address. And then lastly, we will send a link to the recording of this presentation in the coming days. For today's program, I'll start us off with an introduction, then Lubko will bring some perspective to the business case for SBTs, including Scope 3 targets. And then finally, Jasmine will take us through the target setting feature in our application to show you how to set various types of SBTs. We won't be covering the SBTI verification process today because that is something that has to be done with SBTI directly. And our focus here is really to take some of the mystery and the stress out of committing to an SBT. Before I move on, let's have a quick poll question though. Here it is, if you could tell us where you are on your SBT journey. I'll start with an introduction, and many of you probably think of science-based targets in conjunction with the Science-Based Targets Initiative, or SBTI, and I'll come back to that shortly. But the concept has actually been around for over a decade. In 2006, Andrew Sims of the UK think tank, the New Economics Foundation, introduced us to Earth Overshoot Day, which most of you are probably familiar with, but it's the day of the year in which humans have depleted a year's worth of natural resources. And if you're curious, in 2023, Earth Overshoot Day falls on July 27th. And then in 2009, the Stockholm Resilience Center at the University of Stockholm published a paper called Planetary Boundaries, exploring the safe operating space for humanity. What a concept, right? So this idea that Earth systems have quantifiable limits that we need to respect to ensure our own continued existence has been understood for some time. And then science-based emissions reduction targets specifically really gained tremendous momentum after COP21 and the Paris Agreement. And that's in part because they offer this universal approach to effectively mitigating warming gases. But I will say, oh, and I see our poll responses are in, so this is actually quite perfect. We do have some with verified SBTIs, which is great. And it looks like most of you are interested in starting to educate yourselves, and that means this webinar is perfect for you. All right, so let me get back to SBTs here. They are not exclusive to emissions. You can set an SBT for water, for example, in the context of your local water resources, or within the landscape context for your land use target to ensure ecological integrity. Obviously, these types of SBTs, or sometimes also called context-based targets, are really localized and they require a lot of due diligence. Fortunately, the Science-Based Targets Network, or SBTN, which was inspired by, but is not to be confused with SBTI, has recently published some initial guidance to help companies understand that process. But the takeaway here is that we should all start with emissions reduction SBTs at least, and eventually SBTs and context-based targets should become our go-to approach for evaluating sustainability performance. It is truly the only way to make our efforts meaningful. And I'm sorry if the poll was on here this whole time. Okay. I've already mentioned SBTI a couple of times, but as a software application, we're not actually partial to SBTI. It does come up a lot because it has a really high adoption rate and it offers target validation. But when we built the target setting tool, we also incorporated net zero guidance found in the ISO IWA 42 guidance and the recommendations from the UN high-level expert group on the net zero emissions commitments of non-state entities. And both of these are actually slightly more ambitious than the SBTI's absolute contraction approach, or ACA. And I mentioned the ACA here, which is a method that focuses on abatement of absolute emissions, because that is the approach that we currently cover in our application. We do plan to add intensity-based sectoral decarbonization targets next. And here I've just laid out some of the similarities and differences between the three publications. It's by no means an exhaustive list, but I'll call out some highlights. I think it's really important to understand that the standards are actually quite similar across their quantitative dimensions. There are nuances, but they all take this whole value chain approach. They all emphasize reductions over removals. They all require interim targets, and they all have some level of assurance. So with SBTI, it's getting your target validated. With the other two, it's getting third-party assurance of your emissions baseline. One thing I'll call out on the ISO guidance, it could possibly turn into a certifiable standard at some point. Unlike the other standards, it does mention carbon neutrality, which is interesting because they are currently working on a new standard for carbon neutrality. Look out for this. It's called ISO 14068, and it is scheduled to be released next spring or summer. And then one other thing that's really peculiar about ISO is that they require separate scope 1 and 2 SBTs in addition to the scope 3 SBT. It's a little bit unusual. They've gotten some stakeholder pushback on this. So if there is a certifiable standard, this probably won't make it into that. In the interest of time, I won't go into all these bullet points here. And as we share the recording, you can look at those in more detail. All right, let's move on to the business case. Assuming that you've identified emissions as a material issue for your organization and you want to proceed with an SBT, when is the right time to make that public? We hear of companies who take the plunge and they commit to an SBT and they say, you know, we'll figure out how to get there later, while others want to have every detail of their reduction strategies worked out before they're ready to take that plunge. The approach you choose depends on your climate action journey's maturity and also the comfort level of your leadership team. You know, if they are accustomed to setting conservative incremental targets, this might be a difficult transition. So just out of curiosity, Lubko, what is your advice here for companies that are struggling with the right timing for a public SBT commitment?
Well, I will give you the perspective from Europe. In Europe, it's not a wish already, it's a must to set up a science-based target agenda. So, and for different companies, different timings. So larger companies, about 200 employees with turnover over 150 million revenues, I think they are already doing this for 3 or 4 years. They had to do it before and forced by legislation. Now 2024, we have a new legislation coming up and small and medium enterprises will have to do it. And then it will just increase and increase. Small and medium enterprises, especially here in Germany, is a family-owned business, is very rigid structure, very difficult to change. And this for them is also a vehicle for innovation. So I'm excited to see how it's going to evolve after 2024. But we have also smaller companies and startups. They're not obliged to do it yet, and I would recommend for them to first understand how the product will evolve. So how their product and services will be in 5 years, and then invest into sustainability topics. Because if they invest a lot of money, and this is not a cheap entertainment, setting up the targets and the strategy, if they first they need to get the product clear in visibility and services, and then with this you can with science-based agenda you can get a very easy access to the more funding. So different times for different companies.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you so much for your insight here. I should also point out that you can make the decision about when to go public with your SBT commitment while you're developing your emissions baseline, because you'll have to do that for either one of these approaches. SBTI does make an exception for SMEs and allows for what they call a preset target that covers only scope 1 and 2 emissions, but everyone else must have calculated scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. And it is a little bit of an effort to put together an inventory like that. So, that's something you can always get started with right away. It doesn't matter if some of these emissions categories are estimated. That's perfectly acceptable, and it's actually quite common with just where we are on data access and emissions calculation. And then another initiative that you can take while weighing the timing of your commitment and preparing your baseline inventory is to build the business case for ambitious emissions reduction targets. SBTI, the UN, and ISO all promote leadership-driven SBTs. So ideally, your executive leaders would make that commitment. So this is probably a good time to have a bit of this discussion around the benefits of setting SBTs for companies. I think we can all get behind the reputational benefits, this ability to say that your targets is aligned with the best available science, and therefore it's meaningful. And when we say meaningful, it's actually, there's some math behind this, which means that if your base year is 2020, you have to reduce by 4.2% your emissions every year, and then that gets adjusted to be more aggressive if your base year is later. So that's what we're looking for, is for the targets to be meaningful. But I'll also say that there was a study in 2022 of 25 companies with SBTs, and they found that I think all but one were exaggerating their target claims. So let's definitely not do that. And you'll hear us use the word meaningful a lot because that's what an SBT ultimately accomplishes. And we want people to think of SBTs in contrast to targets that fail to deliver the necessary impact. I think at this point, the public is probably well-informed enough to scrutinize targets that don't contribute to our collective goals. And by setting science-based targets, you can also instill confidence in your investors that your company is future-proof, which in itself is also a competitive advantage. But there are some additional benefits, like using SBTs to catalyze innovation, the opportunity to collaborate with stakeholders, and then staying ahead of regulations. Lupko, can you share your perspective on how setting these serious science-aligned targets might drive innovation in companies?
Yes, thank you for this question. Very good, important question. So discussion in Europe is circled. Again, we think Europe is very sustainable and all of that ahead, but they not. The companies are still trying to find a business case for sustainability. And there are 3 reasons why sustainability is a new money-making machine for them, and it can drive the change inside of the companies. First, you can avoid penalties by complying with regulation. And there are lots of regulations coming up in Europe and already in place. So if you would like to avoid penalties, so please comply and become sustainable. Second reason is maintaining the business because the customer growing the business, because I think one of the statistics showed that about 73% of millennials are ready to pay a little bit more for a sustainability premium for the product or services, and just because it's sustainable. So if you want to grow the business, it makes financial sense to become sustainable. And also in Europe, we talk a lot about circularity and bringing back resources into a cycle. So that means the resources are scarce and they are running out. And this is a huge problem, especially for the manufacturing industries, for pharma industries, energy production industries. And it just makes sense to become more sustainable and bring the resources back into the cycle if you want to maintain the business. So there are 3 reasons for making a business case. And this drives the innovation inside of the companies, because if you apply those reasons, there is a lot of space opening up for new initiatives, for new businesses you can create in a company.
Yeah, great. I'm glad to hear you mention this. Is, definitely sounds like it's more of business transformation. And I think an interesting example of this that we're seeing is that many large companies are now taking various measures to directly impact supplier emissions reductions. An example is Google sponsoring energy audits, or IKEA investing into their supplier fleet electrification. Do you think that we'll see more of this type of direct support, financial support in a way, even for suppliers going forward? And is there also a business case for this type of investment?
Definitely. It's, again, very good question. And it's not an easy question because we have complex supply chains in Europe. So there is a lot of suppliers, especially in the manufacturing industry, in the food industry, in the energy industry. And then there are good sides and bad side. In a good side, so if you are really care about your business, you have to invest in your suppliers. And as example, I could give an example from the textile industry, from the social perspective and also from the environmental perspective. So the manufacturer of garments, I cannot name the name, but the manufacturer of garments investing a lot and taking care of audits and supporting the suppliers, not penalizing, but supporting, advising them on how to increase for example, the worker rights in outside of Europe, how to give them more social benefits, how to not only increase the salary, but to create, for example, kindergartens for the children, so that the women can work more productively, or the people can work more productively in the factories. Also, from the environment perspective, there is one company in the energy production sector. They investing, so they transforming from dirty energy into a cleaner energy. And they're investing in the manufacturing facilities. Manufacturing facilities, co-investing, I would say. Of course, the supplier has to transform themselves. They're supporting this with granting them access to finances. So to giving security, basically, before the banks, so they have an access to the banks. And that means for them initially a bigger case, a bigger investment, but in the mid or long term, all the suppliers and the company will win, because the price will drop for the end customers and they potentially will have more customer for the lower price. So sustainability is initially a bigger investment, but in mid and long-term investment, it gives the security to your business and creates a future for your company.
This is great. Yeah, I love the concept of co-investment. That's a really great term. And then also the educational component, which I think even if you're a smaller company that doesn't have a lot of resources, you can already invest in the education of your supply chain. You've already touched on this a little bit about what this means for the future of supplier relationships by talking about, cost reductions and things like that. But how do you think this will impact, how suppliers view their customers and how customers view their suppliers?
Two things, good thing and not so good thing potentially. So if there is a healthy relationship between suppliers in the value supply chain, then it creates loyalty, it creates trust, and trust is I think the most important commodity these days. So if you co-invest, if you grant your suppliers access to finances, if you support them, if you are available to them, if you're responsive, if you are open to discussions, negotiations, to co-creation processes, then it's definitely a healthy, positive relationship. There are companies in Europe also which are a little bit tougher, and I have to mention this, and they investing into supply relationship, but some companies are just say, okay, I have to quickly reduce the emissions. And how can I do this? I just go through the supplier list because I have the power of the money power, and I can choose any supplier I have. And I'm just choosing the supplier who already performs well in terms of sustainability. And it's a tough decision, but those are also cases we see in Europe, and more. So as a supplier, it's not very good idea to wait that somebody will help you to become more sustainable. Just find the money, find the resources, find the power to become sustainable, set up the agenda and implement it, because this will, again, it will be tough initial investment, but will give you more business in the future.
Wonderful. Yeah, I have a feeling there will be some additional questions from our audience about supplier SBTs later and supplier engagement. But let me first squeeze in one more question that I know is a very difficult question, and it's about the correlation between economic growth and absolute emissions reduction. So if you're setting a science-based target and you grow your business, as long as the two are, correlated, then every time your company grows, your emissions rise, and this could potentially wipe out any of the good work that you've done in the past. So how do we decouple the two to continue reduce emissions as our businesses grow? Or do we have to sacrifice growth if we're serious about eliminating greenhouse gas emissions?
Yeah, that's a very good question. Thank you, Constance, for those tough questions. Not easy questions to answer. First of all, I talk a lot with my students about this, and we discuss this a lot in our classes. And also with the customers, we're talking about this, because it's always about the money in the end. And I would say it's impossible to sacrifice the consumption and growth. As long as there are humans on the planet Earth, there would be always a consumption, there will be always some kind of growth. So it's a little bit idealistic thing to think that we can sacrifice the growth in consumption. We have to restructure the consumption and maybe slow down the growth and rethink the growth. What is growth? And those discussions are ongoing at the moment, I know, and there are quite a few solutions. And one of the solutions we're discussing and we are pushing also sometimes with our customers, it's a nature-based solution. So it's basically not using the nature anymore, but looking at nature as inspiration to looking or how the nature solve the problem we are facing now. So most probably you heard about the biomimicry concept. This is an interesting concept, and there are lots of innovation coming up of this concept. I would support this if the company will look more into the biomimicry sphere and get the inspiration from nature. Also, another big topic is circularity. This is where the growth and consumption might find the answer, because if you implement the circularity idea into the consumption, into the growth and the consumption is not a problem anymore. It's just the system, how the system operates. It's not linear anymore, it's more circular. So, and then you consume as much as you like, then you grow as much as you like, but you grow and consume in tune with the nature, not destroying, but contributing. So that would be my answer, hopefully.
Thank you, Lupko. I wish we could have a much longer conversation about this, because this is a really interesting topic, especially this idea of restructuring consumption. As we're seeing more lease versus buy models or SaaS solutions, the right to repair movement, extended producer responsibility. There's quite a lot happening in that space. But unfortunately, we don't have time to cover all of that today. So let me move on and just talk about process for a moment for SBTs. So we assumed earlier that we had developed our emissions baseline, and of course our application has an entire measure section to make this as easy as possible. And then the next step is to set your near-term SBT. I like to think of near-term SBT as sort of milestones that hold companies accountable on their path to net zero, which, by the way, is also a science-based target. For an SME, this can be a pre-calculated scope 1 and 2 target only. For everyone else, we offer a really user-friendly way to set a custom scope 1 and 2 target. And then, and what I mean by that is that we have done a lot of the kind of weeding through the standards, working out the ambiguities, and I'll say there are quite a few of them, putting everything into human language. We've automated target parameter selection whenever possible. So a lot of this work is already done, and that's what I mean by we're making it user-friendly. And once you have your custom scope 1 and 2 target, you can move on to scope 3. If your scope 3 emissions are at least 40% of your inventory, you'll need to decide between an engagement and a reduction target. And I know this is a big sticking point for many companies, so I'll come back to that during the demo when we have a visual to accompany that explanation. An interim target is always required to set a net zero target, but you don't have to set them both at once. We're sometimes asked when it makes sense to launch decarbonization initiatives too. So for instance, should you wait until you have set a target? And the answer is absolutely not. A lot of decarbonization projects also have financial benefits, pretty much every energy efficiency initiative. And in some cases, even buying renewable energy can be cost neutral. So I'd say don't hold off, but if you're launching an initiative after your emissions base year, still track the impact from those initiatives, because you can retrospectively evaluate how they impacted your target. And this probably is a good time to jump into the demo so we can see this infrastructure in action. But first, let's just have another quick poll question, because I'd like to know what your key challenges are in setting SBTs for your organization. And it might be that a few of these apply, so I would say just select the one that is your most pressing challenge. I'll give it just another moment. I always feel like we should have some Jeopardy music playing in the background, and there it is. And that is an almost even distribution here, really interesting. So it looks like the majority don't want to set a target until you know how to get there, which is a really common concern, and we will definitely talk about that a little bit more. Yeah, this is great. So with that, Jasmine, I'm going to hand it off to you to kick off the demo.
Great, thanks, Constance. So before we dive in, let me just give a quick intro to Sustain.Life and what we do here. So we're a software platform that supports companies in measuring, managing, and reducing their environmental impact, namely their carbon emissions. So we saw some questions around how do you get started with measurement? We just saw in the poll answers that companies haven't been able to calculate their baseline, and that's what's preventing them, some of them, from starting to set a target. So I'll show you how that works in the application, but we're really excited to launch a powerful new feature in target setting. And so if you are able to use our platform to measure your data and establish a baseline, the next question is often, what do I do next to actually reduce my emissions over time? So first, you set this target that you can work towards and stay accountable to. So as Constance mentioned, this helps you set a science-based emissions reduction target that aligns with leading standards and guidance. We've already, weeded through all of the guidelines ourselves and built that into the app. So even if you're not sure where to start, we've built those capabilities directly into the product to guide you through each step of collecting the data and setting the target, handling on the math for you on the back end. And generally, we consider this an important feature because we think organizations of all sizes need to feel confident and comfortable in setting a target for themselves and then be able to track their progress over time. This isn't just limited to big enterprise companies that often do have the resources to help them do this. In order to take this ambitious climate action as a global community, we need companies of all sizes to feel confident in setting targets and reducing over time, including small to medium enterprises. So that's what we're excited to show off today. And Constance, if you can just stop sharing your screen, I can go into my demo. Great. We'll go ahead and give you a quick overview of the platform to give you a sense of the first steps you need to take before you even set a target for yourself. So this is the measure part of the Sustain.Life platform. You can see here that it's a series of calculators that help you as an organization translate your business activities across these different categories into carbon emissions. And so you're tracking your full carbon footprint here. And I've collected data for my company for all of 2022 across all of my applicable categories and locations. And you'll see here what we do for you is translate those business activities into emissions and allocate them across scopes 1, 2, and 3, and then the categories that are part of the greenhouse gas protocol here. And why is that important? This is the first step you need to take to even be able to set a target, is to gather your baseline data first. So let me go into our new feature, which is targets under the manage section. And this is a great new feature. It really connects your measure and manage steps. So after you set a baseline, really setting a target to hold yourself accountable to taking those emissions reduction actions over time. So this is our targets dashboard. There's a few different parts of it. The first part that I'll just go into as context setting is our resources tab here. So if you ever have any questions around what are science-based targets, what's SBTI specifically, which is the Science-Based Targets Initiative, that is a leading framework that offers verification for these reduction targets, as well as some other supporting materials around what is carbon accounting and net zero requirements. And this might just be helpful context for any companies looking to get started and wanting to see what other companies in your sector might be doing, companies you might consider your peer companies. So my industry here is apparel design. And we have access to a data set that shows what companies in this sector have done in terms of reporting targets. So out of companies that have reported targets, here's the average target reduction, the average target length, as well as you can see the breakdown of science-based versus non-science-based targets. So this is just helpful context for you to get started and just see what others in your space are doing. And then going back to the dashboard, the first part, as I mentioned, you really need to gather your baseline first for your emissions, so we know what to work on top of. So you'll see here, you can't set a target yet. This is a prerequisite for being able to set a target. So the first thing you'll do is just go into your settings. Provide us some information about your company size and the baseline year you want to use. The company size is important because if you are an SME, according to these guidelines, you're eligible for the preset automatic target track. That is aligned with the Science-Based Targets Initiative. It's a little bit easier. We set a target for you. We pre-calculate the annual and total reduction percentages. So there's very little guesswork that goes into that. But if you're not an SME, that's okay too. Our platform will help you set custom targets across scopes 1, 2, and 3. So the first thing you'll do is just go through and confirm which categories are applicable to your company. And this links back to the measure part of our platform. So you can see here, we've pulled in data for the year 2022 across all of your different categories. So you can easily see what you've already been tracking, maybe what you haven't tracked yet and needs to be tracked. So you might know, I do have purchase steam heat and cooling, haven't tracked yet, I need to go do that. But if it's not an applicable category, you can just uncheck it. So for my company here, I've already gone through here and selected the applicable categories. And then, as Constance mentioned, it is totally okay to use some estimated data, especially for the calculators that Sustain.Life hasn't built into our application yet. We have a handful of scope 3 categories here, but we're able to estimate emissions based on industry data and your own scope 1 and 2 emissions here for you. So don't worry, you'll have a full emissions baseline to work off of, and we'll be able to estimate any missing data for you within these categories. So you still can't move on to the next steps. You need to make some confirmations before doing so. You'll see here under each of the scopes, you'll just need to tell us if each of the categories represents a complete year's worth of data. You can always click into review, which will link you back into the measure part of our platform. So you can easily see what are all the entries I've added across my different locations and my different categories. If anything's missing, you can go ahead and add. But if everything's complete, you can just check the box here to mark as complete. You'll see here now that your scope 1 progress bar is fully complete, and you'll just do the same thing for the other scopes. And then under scope 3, this is a little bit different because you'll see here, there are the estimated categories that I just mentioned on the other page. where you'll see that we've populated an emissions estimate for you. You can just go ahead and use those by default. But if you happen to have actual calculations that you might have gotten from another source, you can always override. But in this case, I'll just use what the application has recommended that I use for estimates. Great. So at this point, you'll see that all scope 1, 2, and 3 categories have been marked as complete. And I can now move on to my next step of actually adding a target. As I add targets, they'll be added to my target progress chart here. But I'll first go into the different types of targets that our application supports. So we support new targets. So if you're a company that doesn't know where to get started or has just completed your baseline emissions, you can set a new target and we'll help you navigate all of the guidance to figure out what kind of target year you should select and the total reduction percentage over time. If you happen to have already set a previous emissions reduction target, you can add it to the dashboard here. Again, we're not going to be helping you set it since you've already set it, but you can track it all in the same place. So under new targets, there are the near-term targets and the long-term targets. Near-term really being in the next few years, up to 10 years out, and long-term, you'll typically hear companies saying that they've set a target for 2050, and these are much more aggressive in terms of the percentage you need to reduce over time. But we'll start with the near-term targets. And my company, I've specified, is an SME, so we have less than 500 employees. So we are actually eligible for the starter target, which is the pre-calculated reduction target for SMEs for scope 1 and 2. So I'll dive into that example first. And you'll see it's very easy. There's nothing you actually have to select other than your base year. We already choose the 2030 target year for you, and we calculate the total reduction percentage that you need to hit in order to be aligned to science-based targets. And this is considered a meaningful reduction. You can exclude up to 5% of your scope 1 and 2 emissions in terms of categories here, and you'll be able to see a warning message if your excluded categories do exceed 5%. But I'll hand it off to Constance to just give a little bit more detail on why you should consider exclusions and when these might be relevant.
Yeah, thanks, Jasmine. I'll give a quick example. So let's say you used the screening method for fugitive emissions from your cooling equipment. And that could just be, you're building air conditioning units. And you find that those emissions are probably less than 1% of your total scope 1 emissions. You also think that those emissions could be nearly impossible to eliminate because maybe you've already retrofitted the units and they're already using refrigerants that have low global warming potential. So this would be a good reason for an exclusion. Of course, you can also include them and decide how to tackle them towards the end of your net zero journey, especially as some of these technologies for refrigerant destruction and low GWP refrigerants are still developing. You don't have to have everything figured out when you set your target. And I'll also quickly explain that exclusions apply to emissions generating activities only. If you don't have a specific emissions generating activity, like let's say your company never has business travel, then the activity doesn't apply to your organization. And that means you don't have to explicitly exclude it. It just doesn't factor into your target at all. So whatever you exclude actually has to be an emissions generating activity.
Great, thanks, Constance.
Sure.
In this case, I'm going to include all of my categories and continue. And from here, I can just name my target, add any notes, and this is a good place to add any notes, especially around why you excluded certain categories and what your rationale was for that. And at that point, you can continue. I've already created some targets, so I'll just navigate back to the dashboard and show what those look like. So this is my scope 1 and 2 starter target that I previously set. You'll be able to see here a trajectory of what your target looks like over time. So 2030 is my target year, and I can always reference back to my target details to see what the total reduction percentage I set was, what my target year was, and what the coverage is. But in this case, you can see my base year was 2022. And so you can see my scope 1 and 2 breakdown here. Those are my actual emissions. But as time goes on, I am following this target trajectory, which is really what I'm going to aim to meet over time. And at the top here, we have an apples to apples comparison. These are all full year emissions. So you can compare your base year emissions of 2022 to what your 2023 target is, and ultimately in 2030, what your emissions will need to be in order for you to hit your final target. So ultimately, you'll have to go from about 1,300 metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent to 736. So this is a great place to reference back to as you're adding data for additional years of 2023, 2024, et cetera. And you'll be able to see here whether you're on track or at risk or off track. And that's all just based on whether or not you've exceeded your current year target, the previous year target. You'll start to see those statuses update as you start to track more progress as the years go on. And another thing that's helpful to overlay here are just some different lines. So you can see how your actual emissions and your target emissions correspond with different lines. And so I'll let Constance give a little bit of a context around what these lines mean for the 1.5 degree and well below 2 degrees Celsius scenarios.
Yeah, so just a quick note here first on the well below 2 degree pathway. That used to be one of the options with SBTI standards, but it is no more. They've done away with this. If you have obviously previously set an SBT under this pathway, you're grandfathered into that. So this is one reason why we included it. And the other is, of course, that it is the officially adopted target of the Paris Agreement. 1.5 and well below 2 degree are temperature pathways for where we want to be at the most in terms of global average temperature rise. And these two are not actually very different scenarios. The somewhat odd language of well below can be a little bit confusing. There are also a few different interpretations, but we understand that to mean that staying well below 2 degrees means that there is a probability of at least 66% that we will not exceed 2 degrees of warming. And when you apply this probability to the carbon budget, it will yield an average global temperature rise of 1.6 degrees Celsius. So it's actually quite close to the 1.5 degrees. But to be clear, 1.5 is still better. And we recommend this pathway because every additional fraction of a degree above that results in worse outcomes for the planet and for us.
Great, thanks, Constance. And you'll also notice this line above here in red, BAU, that stands for business as usual. So that shows an estimate of what we expect your emissions to be if you don't take any actions to reduce. And the reason it's sloping upwards is because it considers some level of company growth over time. And so you'll see the gap between your business as usual lines and the target that you've set is really what you need to make up. Okay, and then I'll just show you some examples of what the custom target looks like. So if you're not an SME, you must set a target using these two instead, scope 1 and 2 and scope 3 custom targets. So in this case, this is not pre-defined for you in terms of automatically setting a target year and reduction, but there are some default options that we pre-populate. We're trying to make this as easy as possible. So based on the target that year that you select, for example, if I select 2030, I'll be able to see what my total reduction needs to be in order to be considered meaningful and aligned to science-based targets. And you'll see there's a bunch of math and guidelines that you need to follow in order to be aligned. And we handle all that for you. So just depending on your target year, you need to have a different annual reduction and total reduction. And that's all populated for you. So I'm just going to select 2030. You can always choose to be more aggressive than what science-based targets requires. So for example, here you can see that I'm actually more aggressive than the meaningful reduction line. Or you can choose to be less aggressive. And so my targets here actually exceed what the meaningful reduction line requires. But you'll see here that that means you're not aligned to the science-based targets frameworks. So we really recommend you can always reference back here what a meaningful total reduction will be. So I'll go back to 42%. Similar to the starter target, you can exclude up to 5% of your scope 1 and 2 emissions from your target. And then this is helpful because it shows you exactly what the criteria is for these different international frameworks. And they have slightly different guidelines. So you may not be aligned to all 3, but if you want to just choose SBTI, for example, you can choose the target year that makes you aligned to it, as well as a total reduction percentage, which is the same across all. And then I'll go into a scope 3 target. There are 2 different types of scope 3 targets, the reduction target, which is very similar to what I've shown already, and an engagement target. For reduction targets, this is all very similar. So you'll see, again, we suggest a total reduction percentage that is considered meaningful, you can always adjust it from there. The one difference is that because Scope 3 emissions are harder to reduce, you can exclude up to 33% of your total Scope 3 emissions. And note that you are required to set a Scope 3 target if your Scope 3 emissions account for more than 40% of your total inventory across Scopes 1, 2, and 3. Under Scope 3, we'll also go into the engagement target, which looks a little bit different. So we'll dive into what that screen looks like specifically. But before I do so, I'll hand it over to Constance again to provide some more context on what this is and how it differs from the other types of targets.
Thank you, Jasmine. Yeah, I mentioned that earlier as a sticking point for companies. Engagement target, because of the language used there, is often mistaken for a soft or kind of workaround target, and it's definitely not that. It actually commits you to getting your own suppliers to set SBTs, and that needs to cover, their SBTs need to cover at least 67% of your overall supply chain emissions. And that means that, one, you have to have an idea of your emissions by supplier so you can prioritize them. And then two, you must be confident that you can get enough of them to set SBTs to cover that 2/3 of your supply chain emissions. One of the benefits with this target is that you can, in fact, take credit for suppliers with existing SBTs, their future reduction count towards your engagement target. And then, this is also a good reason to perform supplier due diligence in advance of onboarding and ask where your prospective suppliers are on setting SBTs, because if they already have one coming in, then you don't have to worry about getting them to set an SBT later on. So this is actually quite a challenging target. I'd make sure not to look at this as a workaround or, an easy target compared to the Scope 3 reduction target, but, it's doable.
Great, thanks, Constance. And I'll show you how you can actually set this target in the application. So you have to cover at least 67% of your total Scope 3 emissions. And how do you do that? You do that by toggling on categories that you want to cover, in addition to a percentage of emissions from that category that you want to cover. By default, we just put in 100%, but you can always adjust this based on the coverage that you'd like to commit to. And so you'll just go through each of these Scope 3 categories and make that determination. And then at the bottom, we do tell you your total coverage. So based on what you've entered here, you see how that number adjusts based on the percentage of emissions that you indicated for each category. In this case, I'm well above the total coverage requirement of 67%, so I can go ahead and save. And when I go back to the dashboard, you'll see that the engagement target looks a little bit different in that there's no progress charts because you're not committing to a reduction percentage over time, but you are able to look back at your engagement target, look at the target year, the coverage percent that you committed to, as well as the included categories. Next, we'll dive into long-term targets, which are called net zero targets. These are more aggressive. It needs to be at least 90%. It's a longer time frame, and it does not permit any offsets. So here you'll be able to set your target, select the target year. So in this case, let me select 2050, for example, and I'll call it my net zero target. Similar to the other types of targets, you can choose to exclude certain categories. Note here that this is slightly different. For Scope 3, your excluded categories should not exceed 10% of your Scope 3 emissions. And you can always, check out different types of categories to exclude and see what that results in total coverage. So downstream transportation distribution for me can be excluded because I'm still at over 90% coverage. But I can also choose to cover 100%. And then my total reduction here, in order to be considered a net zero target aligned with science-based targets, it needs to be at least 90%. It can be up to 100%. And you'll see here that my numbers adjust as I enter my numbers, but by default, we'll populate 90% for you, and you can increase it as you wish. So, and you can also commit to additional reduction through permanent carbon removal, but note that these are not carbon offsets, and offsets don't count towards your net zero target. And I know that this number seems very high and daunting, and you might be wondering, what is permanent carbon removal and what does that look like over time? And so again, I'll hand it off to Constance if you could provide some more color here on how companies can look to achieve net zero targets over time.
Yeah, I definitely agree, Jasmine. 90% does seem very daunting. But in part, that's because all the stars aren't quite aligned yet for a full renewable energy transition. So for instance, we need much stronger policies at all levels of government. But definitely don't let this discourage you, because there is a lot that you can do already. You know, most companies start with energy efficiency and renewable energy purchases. And in many cases, these initiatives are at least cost neutral and also allow for near-term impact reduction. And then after that, consider electrification, especially if you're burning a lot of fuel. The Inflation Reduction Act provides significant rebates for electrification projects. And you can also check for rebates at the state and at the city level. And then engaging with suppliers to reduce product level emissions is a really popular strategy too. And of course, any reductions there are supply chain emissions reduction. The important part is to focus heavily on emissions reductions in your own operations and in supplier operations. And keep in mind with that, that offsets don't count towards your net zero target, though they are still encouraged. We still have to invest in nature. It's kind of easy to overthink how on earth you'll be able to permanently reduce those last 10% in residual emissions. But I'd say focus on a 90% first. In truth, if carbon removal tech turns out not to be scalable, which is one of the fears, this will be a collective problem that we'll need to solve for. It's not just going to be your problem. That said, there are a few promising developments in direct air capture and also enhanced mineralization to remove emissions from the atmosphere and then permanently store them either in underground rock formations or on the ocean floor, or transform the gas into liquid and so on. So ultimately, I think you'll be surprised by how far you can get with known strategies, from renewables and efficiency to behavior-based reductions, fossil fuel divestment, and also focus on circular economy, which is something Lubko brought up earlier.
Okay, thanks, Constance. Just go back to my targets page and go over the last type of target that our application supports. So if your company has previously set an emissions reduction target, you can add it to your dashboard so you can track it alongside the rest of your information. So here, we're not going to help you set the percentage, but you'll merely enter in what you had already set. So let's say you had a base year of 2022 and a target year of 2030, and this is your existing target. You'll just provide us some information about the type of target it was, if it was science-based, what it applied to, whether it was the company, location, or activity level. Note that we don't support intensity targets yet, but that is on the roadmap for the future. Right now, we support absolute targets only. And then you can specify the type of scope 3 target type it is, as well as the total reduction. You can add any additional information, which is particularly important for existing targets. And then you can go back and it will be listed on the dashboard, where you can also track your progress over time, assuming that the data from your base year is in our platform already, which it is in this case for 2022. And that is a walkthrough of our feature. We're really excited to start getting our users in here. And we think this is a really powerful next step after measurement, really linking our measure and manage section. So after you set a target, you can go to the rest of our managed platform and explore our guides and our actions and determine what you can actually do in terms of real tactical actions to reduce your emissions over time. And then as you're doing that over the course of time, you'll come back to our measure platform, start to track those activities and hopefully see a reduction in your emissions. And then lastly, you're looking to tie that all together and make sure that the actions that you're taking are actually resulting in real change and decrease over time, working towards both your short-term targets and your long-term net zero targets. So we're really excited to launch this feature, and we look forward to your feedback. From here, I know we just have a few minutes, but I see we have a lot of questions, so let's go into Q&A.
Actually, I think, Jasmine, we have one more poll question, so maybe we can fit that one in. And there it is. So we're interested in learning what type of target is most important to your organization in addition to SBTs and net zero targets, because obviously organizations set targets for all types of things, not just emissions reduction. Great. We have our results here, and to no surprise, emissions intensity and energy rank pretty highly, which is what we expected and what is next on our list to add to our application. Great. So I've answered questions frantically in chat. I don't think we've ever gotten so many questions on a webinar. We will definitely also take time afterwards to go through the ones we didn't get to, but we do have a time for a couple of them. So I'll first ask you, Lupko, did you see any questions that you wanted to answer?
I was scanning through the question. I see there was a lot of questions related to the platform. I see a question by Elisa about the net zero example for a net zero. I would love to see an example that outlines a net zero strategy. Lisa, if I may ask you, what exactly do you mean by that? Maybe you can write in the chat. You would like to see if the company already set up a net zero strategy, and you would like to know about the industry, what exactly you would like to see, because this is an interesting question. So just a few comments on that. In Europe, a lot of talks are now around net zero strategy, and we are working at Alex with one company who set up a net zero strategy by 2030. It's in United Kingdom. It's an energy production strategy. So they claim before the government that they will become net zero by 2030. And it's difficult. It's so complex. You have to think about so many things. Even if you think about renewable energies going 100% solar or wind, it's not, because you have the equipment, you have the solar panels, you have the wind turbines, and what will you do with them if the lifespan is over? What is about the waste management sector? So even if you use the sludge, for example, or the wood pellets or whatever you use for the production of energy, what do you do with the waste after that? How is your waste management strategy? Because the waste will emit greenhouse gases anyway. So it's they are on the way to do that, but I haven't heard about the successful example yet, to be honest. But people are trying out and working on this.
I'm glad you selected that question, Lupko, because there was a follow-up comment here from Cindy, who said, just to chime in on Lisa's question, I think net zero by 2040 would qualify as a short-term SBT, not a long-term SBT. And I just want to clarify here that near-term SBTs and net zero targets are separate. So it's correct that for a near-term SBT, you have to set a target 5 to 10 years from the date of submission to SBTI. But a net zero target can be any time before 2050. So we actually are seeing companies set net zero targets by 2040. And, you know, in the latest IPCC report, it definitely sounded like that was the preferred time frame for getting to net zero. I haven't heard of anyone doing net zero by 2030, like the example you just mentioned, Lupko. That seems incredibly challenging, but we're definitely seeing companies who are trying to expedite that. Were there any questions you wanted to take, Jasmine?
Yeah, I saw one about adding NIST data to past years.
Yeah.
And that's actually a good point that I wanted to point out. I think there's some hesitancy for companies that are just getting started to publicly commit to or submit to SBTI immediately. So I did want to point out that something our platform supports is editing and deleting of targets. So you can really consider it a sandbox or playground as you're learning about science-based targets. Once you do submit, though, you have committed to it. But what's really great about our platform is it's all integrated. So any changes you make to the measurement part of our platform, so if you realize you're missing locations or there are categories you hadn't filled out, as you enter that data, and you go back to targets and you refresh those targets, all of that will be accounted for. So you don't have to worry about deleting and recreating it. You can either edit existing targets or start from scratch, but all of that's integrated in the same platform.
Great. And we are at the top of the hour. We still have questions we didn't get to. If they're not anonymous, then we will follow up with a response. But other than that, thank you all so much for being here with us today. And we hope that you have a great day. Thanks, everyone.